Picture this, a quiet new kid steps into the chaos of Westwood High, his every move shadowed by the school's most ruthless bullies, until one explosive moment flips the script and rewrites the rules. Welcome to Heartfelt Tales, where raw emotion meets gripping drama, and today's story is no exception. I'm your host, diving deep into the saga of Ethan Rivera, a tale of resilience, revenge, and a fight that no one saw coming. This video is packed with twists, turns, and revelations you won't want to miss, so stick with us to the very end to catch every pulse-pounding detail. If you're ready for a story that hits hard and leaves you thinking, smash that like button now, hit subscribe, and ring the bell, because trust me, you'll want to be here for every heartbeat of this journey. Drop a comment below, have you ever faced a bully? Let's get into it. Part 1, Arrival at Westwood High. The late August sun beat down on Westwood High, a sprawling brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence and a patchy football field. It was the kind of school where everyone knew their place, jocks ruled the hallways, cheerleaders held court in the cafeteria, and the quiet kids stuck to the edges, hoping to slip through senior year unnoticed. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and nervous anticipation as students poured in for the first day, their voices a chaotic hum of laughter, shouts, and the occasional locker slamming shut. For most, it was just another year. For Ethan Rivera, it was day one in a new world. Ethan stepped off the yellow school bus, his worn black backpack slung over one shoulder. At 17, he didn't stand out at first glance, medium height, lean but wiry, with dark hair that fell just above his eyes. His jeans were faded, his gray t-shirt plain, and his sneakers scuffed from years of use. He moved with a quiet purpose, head down, hands in his pockets, blending into the crowd like a shadow. No one would have guessed he'd moved to this small California town just a week ago, uprooted from his old life because of his grandfather's failing health. Ethan didn't mind the change. He wasn't the type to cling to things, or people. Inside, the hallways were a maze of faded posters and buzzing fluorescent lights. Ethan clutched a crumpled schedule in his hand, navigating the chaos to find his locker. Around him, students jostled and chattered, their voices overlapping in a symphony of teenage bravado. A girl with bright pink nails brushed past him, giggling with her friends. A guy in a Letterman jacket elbowed his way through, shouting something about practice. Ethan kept his eyes on the numbers above the lockers, 214, 215, 216, until he found his own, 217. He spun the combination, the lock clicking open with a satisfying snap, and stashed his bag inside. First period was English. He could handle that. But as he turned to head to class, a shadow loomed over him. Not a literal one, though the guy was tall enough to cast one, but the kind of presence that sucked the air out of a room. Ethan glanced up, meeting the eyes of Liam Carter. Liam was everything Westwood High idolized, 18, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that could have been carved from stone. His blonde hair was swept back, his blue eyes sharp and mocking. He wore his football jersey like a badge of honor, the number 12 stretched across his chest. Around him stood his crew, a pack of wolves circling their alpha. Connor, a stocky guy with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, cracked his knuckles idly. Mason, lean and smirking, leaned against a locker, twirling a pen between his fingers. Olivia, all sharp cheekbones and glossy lips, adjusted her cheerleading skirt with a flick of her wrist. And then there was Jake, Liam's younger brother, a sophomore with the same blonde hair and a cocky grin, already a star on the JV basketball team. They were the kings and queens of this place, and they knew it. Liam tilted his head, sizing Ethan up like a predator eyeing prey. New kid, huh? His voice was loud enough to draw a few curious glances from passing students. You look like you got lost on the way to the library. Connor snorted, and Mason let out a low chuckle. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a half-smile, while Jake crossed his arms, waiting for the show. Ethan didn't flinch. He met Liam's gaze for a split second, long enough to register the challenge, then dropped his eyes back to his schedule. Without a word, he stepped around Liam and started down the hall. Hey, I'm talking to you. Liam called after him, his tone edged with irritation. Ethan didn't stop. The crowd parted slightly as he walked, a ripple of whispers following in his wake. Liam's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he turned to his crew with a shrug. "Guess he's too good for us," he said, loud enough for Ethan to hear. Connor laughed again, and the group moved off, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat. Ethan didn't look back. He slipped into room 104 just as the bell rang, sliding into a desk near the window. The classroom smelled of old books and dry erase markers, and the teacher, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose, started droning on about The Great Gatsby. Ethan pulled out a notebook and a pen, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. He wasn't here to make waves. He just wanted to get through the year, graduate, and figure out what came next. That was the plan, anyway. The morning passed in a blur of lectures and hallway shuffles. By the time lunch rolled around, Ethan had already mapped out the school in his head, where the exits were, which stairwells were quiet, how to avoid the bottlenecks of chattering cliques. He grabbed a tray from the cafeteria line, pizza, an apple, a carton of milk, and scanned the room for a spot. The tables were a patchwork of territories, the jocks by the windows, the theater kids near the vending machines, the loners scattered along the edges. Ethan picked a corner table, empty except for a kid with headphones who didn't look up. Perfect. He'd barely taken a bite when he felt eyes on him again. Liam and his crew had claimed their usual spot, center of the room, loud and untouchable. Liam was sprawled in his chair, one arm slung over the back, recounting some story about last week's practice. His voice carried, cutting through the din like a blade. Ethan kept his head down, focusing on his food. He wasn't stupid, he knew guys like Liam thrived on attention, on picking out the weak links and snapping them. Ethan had seen it before, at his old school. He just didn't care enough to play the game. But Liam wasn't done with him yet. As Ethan took a sip of milk, a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Jake standing there, hands in his pockets, that same cocky grin plastered on his face. "You're the new guy, right?" Jake said, his tone casual but laced with something sharper. "Liam says you think you're hot shit, ignoring him like that." Ethan set the carton down, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I don't think anything," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, the kind that didn't invite argument. Jake blinked, thrown off by the lack of heat in the response. "Yeah, well," Jake hesitated, glancing back at Liam, who was watching from across the room. "Better watch yourself, man. This isn't your turf." He lingered for a second, then sauntered back to the group, leaving Ethan alone again. The rest of lunch passed without incident. Ethan finished his food, tossed the tray in the trash, and headed to his next class, history, then gym, then the final bell. He moved through the day like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, his answers short and to the point. Teachers didn't call on him much, other students barely noticed him. That was how he liked it. By the time he stepped onto the bus home, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Ethan leaned his head against the window, the rumble of the engine vibrating through him. He thought about Liam's smirk, Jake's warning, the way the air had shifted when he walked away. It wasn't fear he felt, not even close. It was something else, something he couldn't quite name yet. Back at home, a small house on the edge of town, he dropped his bag by the door and found his grandfather in the living room. Carlos Rivera sat in an old armchair, a cane resting against the wall. His hair was gray, his hands scarred from years of hard living, but his eyes were sharp, piercing. "How was it?" Carlos asked, his voice gravelly but warm. Ethan shrugged. "Fine. Just school." Carlos studied him for a moment, then nodded. "He didn't push. He never did." Ethan grabbed a glass of water and sat across from him, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Outside, the crickets started their chorus, and the day slipped away. But in the back of Ethan's mind, Liam Carter lingered, a spark waiting to catch fire. Part 2, Escalation. The first week at Westwood High slipped by like a slow-moving storm cloud, grumbling, heavy, but not yet breaking. Ethan Rivera settled into a routine: bus to school, classes, lunch alone, bus home. He kept his head down, his words few, his presence barely a ripple in the loud, churning sea of teenage life. But Liam Carter wasn't the type to let a ripple go unnoticed. To him, Ethan wasn't just the new kid anymore, he was a puzzle, a quiet defiance that gnawed at the edges of Liam's carefully built kingdom. And Liam didn't like puzzles he couldn't solve. It started small, the way these things often do. Monday morning, Ethan was at his locker, swapping out books for second period, when Connor brushed past him, too hard, too deliberate. Ethan's shoulder hit the metal door with a dull clang, and his history textbook slipped to the floor. Connor didn't stop, didn't apologize, just kept walking with a smirk tugging at his lips. Ethan bent down, picked up the book, and dusted it off. His face stayed blank, his breathing steady. A few kids nearby glanced over, waiting for a shout, a shove, something. Nothing came. Ethan shut his locker and moved on. By Tuesday, it wasn't just Connor. In gym class, the air thick with the smell of sweat and rubber mats, Liam took his shot. The teacher had them running laps around the track, a warm-up for the football drills Liam lived for. Ethan kept an even pace, his stride smooth and unhurried, while Liam and Jake sprinted ahead, showing off for the girls on the bleachers. Halfway through, Liam slowed down, falling into step beside Ethan. "You run like you're scared of breaking a nail," Liam said, loud enough for the whole class to hear. Jake laughed, a sharp bark that echoed across the field. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't even look at Liam, just kept running, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Liam's grin tightened. He sped up, cutting in front of Ethan so close their sneakers nearly tangled. Ethan sidestepped without missing a beat, his rhythm unbroken. The teacher blew the whistle, ending the laps, and Liam jogged off with a muttered curse. Ethan finished his loop and headed for the water fountain, wiping sweat from his brow. From the sidelines, Olivia watched, her arms crossed, her head tilted like she was trying to figure him out. Mason caught her eye and snickered. "What's with this guy? He's a freaking robot." Wednesday brought the cafeteria incident. Ethan was at his usual corner table, picking at a chicken sandwich, when the room's energy shifted. He didn't need to look up to know Liam was coming, there was a rhythm to it, the way the noise dipped and swelled, the way heads turned like flowers tracking the sun. Liam sauntered over, his tray balanced in one hand, a can of soda in the other. His crew trailed behind, a loose semicircle of smirks and anticipation. Ethan kept eating, his fork moving methodically from plate to mouth. "Hey, new kid," Liam said, stopping a few feet away. His voice was casual, but it carried that edge, the one that said he was fishing for a reaction. Ethan glanced up, just long enough to acknowledge him, then went back to his food. Liam's eyes narrowed. He popped the tab on his soda, took a sip, and then, oops, his hand slipped. The can tipped, and a stream of fizzy brown liquid splashed across Ethan's tray, soaking his sandwich and pooling around his apple. A chorus of gasps and stifled laughs rippled through the cafeteria. Ethan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Soda dripped onto the table, a steady plink plink plink. Liam stepped back, hands raised in mock innocence. "My bad, man. Clumsy me." Connor guffawed, slapping the table, while Olivia bit her lip, her eyes darting between the two of them. Jake leaned forward, grinning like a kid at a circus. The room held its breath, waiting for Ethan to snap, yell, throw a punch, anything. He didn't. Ethan set his fork down, slow and deliberate. He pushed his chair back, stood, and picked up the dripping tray. Without a word, he walked to the trash can, dumped the whole mess inside, and headed for the exit. The silence broke as he passed, whispers, giggles, a low whistle from someone in the back. Liam stood there, arms crossed, his smirk fading into something harder. "What a freak," he said, loud enough for Ethan to hear. But Ethan didn't turn around. The double doors swung shut behind him, and the cafeteria roared back to life. That night, Ethan sat on the porch of his house, the sky a deep bruise of purple and blue. Carlos was inside, the TV murmuring some old war movie he'd seen 100 times. Ethan leaned back against the railing, his hands clasped around a glass of water, replaying the day. The soda on his tray, Liam's taunting grin, the weight of all those eyes, it didn't bother him, not really. He'd dealt with worse. But he could feel it building, the slow simmer of something he'd rather keep buried. He took a sip of water, letting the coolness ground him, and pushed the thought away. Thursday was quieter, but not by much. In the hallway between classes, Mason tripped and knocked Ethan's books out of his arms. Papers scattered across the linoleum, and Mason kept walking, tossing a "sorry, dude" over his shoulder that didn't sound sorry at all. Ethan crouched down, gathering his stuff, while a couple of girls nearby whispered behind their hands. He didn't rush, didn't glare, just collected his things and moved on. Later, in history class, he found his textbook missing from his desk. It turned up 10 minutes later, shoved under a chair across the room, its cover bent. Ethan retrieved it without comment, flipping it open to the right page as if nothing had happened. Friday was when it got physical again. Gym class, dodgeball this time. The teacher split them into teams, and Ethan ended up on the opposite side from Liam's crew. The game started fast, rubber balls flying, kids shouting, sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Ethan hung back, catching more than he threw, his movements quick but controlled. Liam, of course, was all swagger. Hurling balls like they were grenades, aiming for heads and laughing when they hit. Halfway through, he locked eyes with Ethan across the court. "Here you go, new kid," Liam shouted, winding up and launching a ball straight at Ethan's chest. It was a hard throw, the kind that stung even through a shirt. Ethan twisted at the last second, catching it one-handed with a soft thud. The gym went quiet for a beat, then erupted in cheers from Ethan's team. Liam's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "Lucky catch," he called, but his voice had an edge now, sharp and brittle. The game went on, and Liam's throws got wilder, all aimed at Ethan. One grazed his shoulder, another clipped his leg. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't retaliate, just kept playing, dodging and catching with that same eerie calm. Connor joined in, lobbing a ball that bounced off Ethan's arm, and Jake followed with a sneaky underhand shot that missed entirely. By the time the whistle blew, Ethan's team had won, and Liam's face was a storm cloud. He stalked off the court, muttering to his crew, while Ethan grabbed his water bottle and took a long drink. Word spread fast. By the end of the day, the school was buzzing with it, not just the dodgeball game, but the whole week. "Did you see the new kid? Liam's pissed. He doesn't even fight back, it's weird. What's his deal?" Ethan heard the whispers as he walked to the bus, felt the stares prickling his skin. He didn't care. Let them talk. Let Liam push. It didn't change anything. At home, Carlos noticed the tension in Ethan's shoulders, the way he sat a little too still at the kitchen table. "Rough day?" the old man asked, stirring a pot of beans on the stove. Ethan shrugged, picking at a scratch on the wood. "Same as always." Carlos raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He slid a plate of food in front of Ethan, beans, rice, a tortilla, and sat across from him. "You're quiet, even for you," he said after a while. Ethan chewed slowly, then met his grandfather's eyes. "Just some guy at school. Thinks he runs the place." "Does he?" Carlos asked, his tone neutral. Ethan thought about it, Liam's swagger, the way the halls bent around him, the fear he fed on. "Maybe," he said finally. "For now." Carlos nodded, like he understood more than Ethan was saying. They finished dinner in silence, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. Later, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the week replaying in his head. Liam's voice, Connor's shoves, the soda soaking his tray. He wasn't mad, not yet. But he could feel it, that slow burn under his skin, the one Carlos had taught him to control. He closed his eyes, breathing deep, and let it fade. Outside, the night stretched on, dark and restless, waiting for the storm to break. Part 3, The Breaking Point. The second week at Westwood High dawned gray and heavy, the sky pressing down like a lid on a boiling pot. Ethan Rivera felt it in the air, a restless hum that matched the itch under his skin. He'd made it through the first week without cracking, without giving Liam Carter the fight he so clearly wanted. But the game was shifting now, the rules bending. Ethan could sense it in the way the hallways buzzed, the way eyes followed him a little longer than before. He wasn't invisible anymore, and that wasn't a good thing. Monday started with a warning. Ethan was at his locker, sliding his English notebook into his bag, when Jake Carter appeared, alone this time, no Liam or crew to back him up. The sophomore leaned against the lockers, arms crossed, his blonde hair falling into his eyes. "You're making my brother mad, you know," Jake said, his tone half curious, half accusing. Ethan didn't look up, just kept packing his things. "He doesn't like being ignored." Ethan zipped his bag shut, meeting Jake's gaze for a moment. "Not my problem," he said quietly, then turned to leave. Jake stepped in front of him, blocking the path, not aggressive, just stubborn. "It will be," Jake said, his voice low. "Liam's not gonna let this go." He held Ethan's stare for a beat, then stepped aside, letting him pass. Ethan walked away, the warning ringing in his ears. He didn't doubt Jake was right. Liam wasn't the type to back off, he'd keep pushing until something broke. Ethan just hoped it wouldn't be him. Tuesday was gym again, and the air crackled with it. The teacher had them playing basketball, a chaotic free-for-all of bouncing balls and shouted trash talk. Ethan stayed on the fringes, passing when he had to, shooting only when the lane was clear. Liam, though, was a force, dribbling hard, elbowing through defenders, slamming the ball into the hoop with a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. Halfway through, he caught Ethan's eye across the court and smirked. The next play, Liam drove straight at Ethan, shoulder lowered like a battering ram. Ethan sidestepped, letting Liam crash past, but not before their arms collided, hard. Pain flared up Ethan's elbow, sharp and hot, but he didn't flinch. Liam spun around, ball in hand, and laughed. "Gotta watch where you're standing, new kid." Connor, guarding the baseline, chuckled, and Mason called out, "He's too slow for you, Liam." Ethan shook out his arm, his face blank, and got back into position. The game rolled on, but the hit lingered, a bruise forming, a line crossed. Wednesday morning, Ethan found his locker vandalized. Someone, probably Mason, given his knack for sneaky crap, had scrawled "loser" across the door in black marker. A few kids snickered as they passed, their phones snapping quick pics before hurrying off. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then grabbed a tissue from his bag and wiped at the word. It smeared into a blurry mess, but the letters stayed, stubborn and stark. He didn't bother reporting it, just opened the locker, got his books, and moved on. By lunch, the whole school had seen it, and the whispers were louder now, Liam's crew's got it out for him. Why doesn't he do something? That afternoon, the breaking point came. It was lunch again, the cafeteria packed and noisy, the smell of fries and pizza hanging thick in the air. Ethan sat at his corner table, picking at a burger, when Liam and his crew made their move. They didn't bother with subtlety this time, Liam led the charge, flanked by Connor and Mason, with Olivia and Jake trailing behind. The room quieted as they approached, a hush falling like a curtain. Liam stopped a foot from Ethan's table, his shadow stretching across the scratched plastic surface. "You're a real tough guy, huh?" he said, his voice loud, performative. "Sitting here all quiet, like you're better than us." Ethan didn't look up, just took another bite of his burger. Liam's grin twisted into something uglier. He reached out, grabbed Ethan's tray, and yanked it toward him. Ethan's hands shot out instinctively, catching the edge, but Liam was stronger. He shoved the tray back, hard, knocking Ethan's shoulder and sending him off balance. The chair tipped, and Ethan went down. The tray hit the floor with a crash, burger and fries scattering across the tiles, a smear of ketchup streaking like blood. The cafeteria erupted, gasps, laughter, a few cheers from Liam's loyalists. Ethan landed on his side, one hand braced against the ground, his jeans stained with grease. Liam towered over him, hands on his hips, grinning like he'd just won a championship. "Oops," he said, dragging the word out. "Guess you slipped." Connor hooted, slapping Mason's shoulder, while Olivia smirked, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the crowd now gathering around. Ethan stayed down for a second, his breath steady, his mind racing. He could feel the heat rising, the urge to stand up and swing, to wipe that grin off Liam's face with one clean hit. But he didn't. He pushed himself up, slow and deliberate, brushing the dirt off his hands. And then he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a faint curve of his lips, barely there, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Liam's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. The crowd went silent, the air thick with confusion. Ethan's smile wasn't angry, wasn't mocking, it was something else, something cold and unreadable, like he knew a secret Liam didn't. He stepped over the mess on the floor, picked up his backpack, and walked out, leaving the tray where it lay. Liam stared after him, his fists clenching, a shiver running down his spine. That smile, it wasn't right. It wasn't what he'd wanted. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan went to class, sat through lectures, ignored the stares and whispers that followed him like a shadow. By the time he got home, the sun was sinking, casting long fingers of light across the living room. Carlos was there, as always, sitting in his armchair with a cup of coffee. He didn't look up from his newspaper as Ethan dropped his bag by the door, but his voice cut through the quiet. "You're late." "Walked home," Ethan said, kicking off his shoes. He didn't mention the bus, how he'd skipped it to clear his head, to shake off the weight of that moment in the cafeteria. Carlos folded the paper, setting it on the table. His eyes, dark, sharp, weathered, fixed on Ethan. "Something's eating you," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan hesitated, then sank onto the couch across from him. He rubbed his hands together, the faint ache in his elbow still there from gym. "It's this guy at school," he said finally. "Keeps pushing. Today he knocked me down in front of everyone." Carlos didn't react, just waited, letting the silence pull the rest out. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I didn't do anything. Just got up and left. But it's getting harder to keep walking away." "Why didn't you hit him?" Carlos asked, his tone even, like he was asking about the weather. Ethan frowned, staring at the floor. "Don't want to. Not yet. But I don't want to be his punching bag either." He looked up, meeting his grandfather's gaze. "I don't know what to do." Carlos took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down. He leaned back, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, and for a moment, he looked older than his 68 years, worn by battles Ethan could only imagine. "You remember what I taught you," he said. "All those years in the garage, the moves I showed you. Strength isn't about throwing the first punch. It's about ending the fight when it's time." Ethan nodded, the words sinking in. Carlos had started training him when he was 6, basic stances at first, then punches, kicks, locks. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about control, about knowing when to act and when to wait. Back then, it had been a game, a way to bond with the old man who'd seen too much. Now, it felt like a lifeline. "He's not worth it," Ethan said, more to himself than to Carlos. "Not yet. Carlos's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile. That's your call, Mijo. Just make sure when you decide, you're ready to finish it. He picked up his paper again, signaling the conversation was done, but his eyes lingered on Ethan a moment longer, proud, steady, trusting. Ethan stood, grabbing his bag and heading to his room. He dropped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling, the day replaying in his mind. The fall, the laughter, that smile he hadn't meant to give. He didn't know why he'd done it, maybe to throw Liam off, maybe to keep himself from breaking. Whatever it was, it had changed something. He could feel it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the night closed in, a quiet promise of what was coming. Part 4, The Confrontation. Thursday morning broke clear and crisp, the kind of day that felt too bright for the storm brewing beneath it. Ethan Rivera woke with a quiet resolve, the words of his grandfather Carlos still echoing in his head, strength isn't about throwing the first punch. It's about ending the fight when it's time, he didn't know if today would be that time, but he could feel it coming, the pressure building like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Liam Carter had pushed too far, and Ethan wasn't sure how much longer he could keep walking away. School started normal enough. Ethan moved through his classes, English, math, history, with the same steady rhythm he always did, his notebook open, his pen scratching out answers. But the air was different. Whispers followed him like a shadow, louder now, more urgent. Did you hear? Liam's pissed about yesterday. He's gonna do something big. The new kid's toast. Ethan heard it all, felt the weight of every glance, but he kept his eyes forward, his face blank. Let them talk. Let them guess. He wasn't here for their drama. By lunch, the rumors had solidified into something tangible. Ethan was at his corner table, picking at a turkey sandwich, when a sophomore he vaguely recognized, a skinny kid with glasses, slid into the seat across from him. Hey, Rivera, right? The kid said, voice low, nervous. Ethan nodded, not looking up. The kid leaned in. Liam's telling everyone he's gonna mess you up after school. Behind the gym. Thought you should know. Ethan set his sandwich down, meeting the kid's eyes. Thanks, he said simply. The sophomore hesitated, like he wanted to say more, then bolted back to his own table. Ethan chewed slowly, processing. Behind the gym, secluded, no teachers, perfect for a setup. Liam wasn't just pushing anymore, he was drawing a line. Ethan finished his food, tossed the tray, and headed to his next class, his mind turning over Carlos's advice. When it's time, maybe it was. The rest of the day crawled by, the clock ticking like a heartbeat. Gym was last period, and Liam's crew was louder than usual, laughing too hard, shoving each other, their eyes darting to Ethan every few minutes. Liam didn't say anything directly, just smirked from across the court as they ran drills, his confidence radiating like heat. Connor cracked his knuckles, Mason whispered something to Jake, and Olivia twirled her ponytail with a knowing grin. Ethan kept his distance, his movements smooth and controlled, but he could feel their plan tightening around him like a net. When the final bell rang, the school emptied fast, kids spilling out to buses, cars, the parking lot. Ethan lingered at his locker, swapping books, letting the crowd thin. He didn't rush, didn't hide, just took his time, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Word had spread, a few students hung back, whispering, their eyes flicking toward the gym. Ethan stepped outside, the afternoon sun warm on his face, and started toward the back of the building. He wasn't running. If Liam wanted this, he'd get it. The area behind the gym was a concrete slab surrounded by a chain-link fence and a row of scraggly bushes. It smelled of dust and sweat, the faint echo of football practice drifting from the field beyond. A small crowd had already gathered, maybe 20 kids, a mix of Liam's loyalists and curious onlookers. Their phones out, ready to record. Ethan walked up alone, hands in his pockets, his sneakers scuffing the ground. The murmurs died down as he stopped a few yards from the group. Liam stood at the center, arms crossed, his football jersey stretched tight across his shoulders. Connor and Mason flanked him, their postures loose but tense, like dogs straining at a leash. Olivia leaned against the fence, her cheerleading skirt bright against the gray concrete, while Jake hovered a step behind, his usual grin replaced by something harder. Liam tilted his head, sizing Ethan up, then smirked. "Didn't think you'd show," he said, his voice carrying across the slab. "Guess you're not as chicken shit as I thought." Ethan didn't respond, just stood there, his expression calm, unreadable. The crowd shifted, a ripple of anticipation. Liam stepped forward, cracking his neck like he was warming up for a game. "You've been pissing me off all week, new kid," he said. "Acting like you're too good to react. That little smile yesterday? Big mistake." Still nothing from Ethan. He shifted his weight slightly, hands sliding out of his pockets, resting loose at his sides. Liam's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. "What's your deal, huh? You mute or just stupid?" Connor snorted, and Mason added, "Maybe he's scared stiff." The crowd laughed, a nervous edge to it. Ethan spoke then, his voice low but clear. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Walk away." Liam froze for a second, thrown by the warning, quiet, steady, not a plea but a fact. Then he laughed, sharp and loud, turning to his crew. "Hear that? He's giving me advice." Connor grinned, flexing his fists, while Olivia rolled her eyes. Jake shifted his feet, glancing at his brother. Liam turned back to Ethan, his grin gone. "You don't tell me what to do." He lunged. It was fast, a quarterback's speed, muscle and momentum driving a fist straight at Ethan's face. The crowd gasped, phones tilting up. Ethan moved faster. He ducked left, Liam's punch slicing through empty air, and in one fluid motion, he grabbed Liam's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and shoved. Liam stumbled forward, off balance, and Ethan swept his legs out from under him with a quick kick. Liam hit the concrete hard, a grunt escaping as his palms slapped the ground. The crowd went silent, stunned. Liam scrambled up, red-faced, fury replacing shock. "You little," he charged again, wilder this time, aiming a tackle at Ethan's midsection. Ethan sidestepped, caught Liam's arm, and used his momentum to flip him over his hip. Liam landed on his back with a thud, the air whooshing out of him. He lay there, gasping, eyes wide with disbelief. Connor roared and rushed in, fists swinging. Ethan ducked under a haymaker, grabbed Connor's forearm, and yanked him forward while driving a knee into his stomach. Connor doubled over, wheezing, and Ethan twisted his arm behind him, locking it tight until Connor dropped to his knees, cursing through gritted teeth. Mason came next, faster but sloppier, throwing a punch at Ethan's jaw. Ethan blocked it with his forearm, stepped inside Mason's guard, and delivered a short, sharp elbow to his chest. Mason staggered back, clutching his ribs, then tripped over his own feet and fell. It was over in seconds, 3 moves, 3 bodies on the ground. The crowd stood frozen, mouths open, phones still recording but forgotten in their hands. Olivia's smirk vanished, her arms dropping to her sides. Jake took a half-step forward, then stopped, his hands clenching and unclenching. Ethan straightened, breathing steady, not a mark on him. He looked down at Liam, who was pushing himself up, dirt streaked across his jersey. "You're not strong," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You just feed off other people's fear." He held Liam's gaze, unblinking, letting the words sink in. Liam's face twisted, anger, shame, something raw and unguarded. He didn't reply, just glared, his chest heaving. Ethan turned to leave, stepping over Connor, who was still on his knees, clutching his stomach. The crowd parted, a sea of wide eyes and hushed breaths. He didn't look back, didn't rush, just walked away, his steps even, his hands back in his pockets. Behind him, Liam staggered to his feet, brushing off Mason's offer of a hand. "Get off me," he snapped, his voice hoarse. The crowd started to disperse, murmurs rising like a tide. "Did you see that? He took them all down. Liam's done." Ethan rounded the corner of the gym, the noise fading behind him. He stopped, leaning against the wall, and let out a slow breath. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline, the rush of finally letting go. He'd ended it, just like Carlos said. No anger, no hate, just precision, control, and a line drawn in the dirt. He flexed his fingers, the tremor fading, and started to walk home. The sun was dipping low by the time he reached the house, casting long shadows across the porch. Carlos was there. Sitting with his cane propped against the railing, a glass of water in his hand. He didn't look surprised when Ethan climbed the steps, just raised an eyebrow. "You're late again," he said. "Had to take care of something," Ethan replied, dropping his bag by the door. He sat on the edge of the porch, stretching out his legs, the ache in his muscles a quiet reminder of what he'd done. Carlos studied him, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "That guy at school?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Him and his friends. It's over now. Did you start it?" Carlos's tone was even, but there was a weight to the question. "No," Ethan said. "But I finished it." Carlos took a sip of water, then set the glass down. A faint smile tugged at his lips, not big, just enough to show he approved. "Good," he said. "That's how it's supposed to be." They sat there for a while, the evening settling around them, crickets chirping in the distance. Ethan didn't feel victorious, didn't feel like a hero, just tired, relieved, ready to move on. He'd crossed a threshold today, one he hadn't wanted to, but it was done. Liam wouldn't come for him again. He knew it in his bones. Back at school, the video was already spreading, grainy clips of Ethan's moves, Liam's fall, the stunned faces in the crowd. By morning, it'd be everywhere. But for now, Ethan let it go, the weight lifting as the night deepened. He'd ended the fight. That was enough. Part 5, Fallout and Resolution. Friday morning dawned quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a storm. Ethan Rivera woke early, the ache in his muscles a faint echo of the fight behind the gym. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, the events of the previous afternoon replaying in his mind, Liam's charge, the blur of motion, the concrete under his feet. It didn't feel like a victory, not the way movies made it seem. It just felt done. He rolled out of bed, pulled on a clean t-shirt and jeans, and headed downstairs. Today would be different. He could sense it. Carlos was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and the morning paper. The old man didn't look up as Ethan grabbed a glass of water, but his voice cut through the quiet. "Sleep okay?" he asked, turning a page. "Yeah," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "You?" Carlos grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, then folded the paper and set it aside. His eyes, sharp, weathered, fixed on Ethan. "You're not limping," he said. "Good sign." Ethan flexed his right hand, the one that had locked Liam's wrist. "Didn't get hit," he replied. "Just like you taught me." A faint smile tugged at Carlos's lips, there and gone. "Smart kid," he said, then nodded toward the stove. "Made eggs. Eat something before you go." Ethan didn't argue. He scooped scrambled eggs onto a plate, added a piece of toast, and sat across from his grandfather. They ate in silence, the clink of forks against ceramic the only sound. It was comfortable, familiar, a ritual that grounded him after yesterday's chaos. When he finished, he rinsed his plate, grabbed his backpack, and headed for the door. "See you later," he called. "Stay out of trouble," Carlos shot back, his tone dry but warm. Ethan smirked, stepping into the cool morning air, and started the walk to the bus stop. Westwood High was a different beast when he arrived. The usual hum of chatter was louder, sharper, threaded with something electric. Heads turned as Ethan stepped off the bus, eyes tracking him through the parking lot. He kept his pace steady, his hands in his pockets, ignoring the whispers that trailed him like smoke. "That's him." He took down Liam. "Did you see the video?" Phones were out, screens flickering with grainy footage from behind the gym, Ethan dodging, flipping, walking away. It had spread overnight, a wildfire he couldn't outrun. The hallways were worse. Lockers slammed, voices overlapped, but the stares were relentless. Ethan made it to 217, spinning the combination with practiced ease, when a voice broke through the noise. "Yo, Rivera." He glanced up to see a guy from his history class, tall, lanky, with a mop of curly hair, grinning at him. "That was insane, man. You're a legend." Ethan shrugged, pulling out his books. "Just happened," he said, keeping his tone flat. The guy laughed, clapping him on the shoulder before heading off. Ethan shut his locker, the metal clanging shut, and started toward English. He didn't want to be a legend. He didn't want any of this. First period passed in a haze, the teacher droning about poetry while Ethan doodled in the margins of his notebook. Second period was math, and a girl he didn't know slipped him a note. "You're badass," he crumpled it up, shoving it into his bag. By third period, history, the buzz had settled into a low roar, but the eyes were still there, watching, waiting. Ethan kept his head down, his pen moving across the page, tuning it out. Lunch was the real test. He grabbed a tray, pizza again, an apple, a water bottle, and headed for his corner table. The cafeteria was packed, the air thick with grease and chatter, but it went quiet as he walked in. Every table turned, every conversation paused. Ethan didn't flinch, just kept moving, his steps even. He set his tray down, sat, and took a bite of pizza, acting like nothing had changed. Slowly, the noise crept back, whispers at first, then full voices, but the shift was palpable. He wasn't invisible anymore. Across the room, Liam Carter sat at his usual table, surrounded by his crew. But it wasn't the same. Liam's posture was stiff, his shoulders hunched, his jersey wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Connor had a bruise on his jaw, Mason kept rubbing his chest, and Olivia's usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. Jake was the odd one out, sitting a little apart, his eyes darting between his brother and the rest of the room. Liam didn't look up, didn't shout, didn't do anything. He just ate, his fork stabbing at his food with too much force. Ethan watched them for a moment, then looked away. He didn't feel smug or satisfied, just tired. He'd ended it, like he'd told Carlos, but the aftermath was messier than he'd expected. The crowd didn't matter to him, but Liam's silence did. It was a crack in the armor, a sign that something had broken. Halfway through lunch, Ethan made a decision. He stood, leaving his tray, and walked toward Liam's table. The room hushed again, a wave of tension rolling through. Liam's crew froze, Connor's hand tightened on his fork, Mason's eyes widened, Olivia straightened up. Jake just stared, his mouth half open. Ethan stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady on Liam. Liam looked up, his blue eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched. For a second, neither of them moved, the air thick between them. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low, firm. "It's done," he said. 2 words, simple and final. He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and walked back to his table, the cafeteria holding its breath until he sat down. Liam didn't say anything. He dropped his eyes back to his tray, his hands curling into fists under the table. Connor muttered something, but Liam snapped, "Shut up," his voice rough, defeated. Olivia glanced at Jake, who shook his head slightly, like he didn't know what to do. The table stayed quiet, the center of Westwood High suddenly off balance, adrift. Ethan finished his lunch, tossed the tray, and headed to his next class. The stares followed, but they were different now, less curious, more cautious. He didn't care. He'd said what he needed to say. The rest was up to Liam. The afternoon dragged on, gym, then biology, then the final bell. Ethan skipped the bus again, walking home under a sky streaked with gold and pink. The school faded behind him, the noise replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. He felt lighter, like a weight had lifted, though he couldn't pinpoint when it had happened. Maybe it was the fight, maybe the words in the cafeteria. Maybe it was just time. At home, Carlos was in the backyard, a rare sight. The old man stood by the garage, a wooden dummy set up in the grass, a relic from Ethan's early training days. He was tossing light punches at it, his movements slow but precise, his cane leaning against the wall. Ethan dropped his bag on the porch and joined him, the familiar scent of oil and wood hitting him as he stepped closer. "Thought you'd be resting," Ethan said, hands in his pockets. Carlos snorted, landing a soft jab. "Resting's for the dead. Come here." He stepped back, gesturing to the dummy. "Show me what you've got." Ethan hesitated, then moved in. He started slow, left jab, right cross, a quick step to the side. The rhythm came back easy, muscle memory kicking in. Carlos watched, nodding slightly, his eyes tracking every move. "Faster," he said. Ethan picked up the pace, his fists snapping out, the thwack of skin on wood echoing in the yard. He added a kick, low and sharp, then a block, flowing from one motion to the next. After a few minutes, Carlos raised a hand. "Enough," he said. Ethan stopped, breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Carlos picked up his cane, leaning on it as he studied him. "You're still sharp," he said. "Good." Ethan wiped his brow, catching his breath. "Had to be, yesterday." Carlos nodded, his expression softening. "Heard about it. Kids talk loud around here." He paused, then added, "You didn't start it, right?" "No," Ethan said. "Just ended it." "That's my boy," Carlos said, a rare warmth in his voice. He tapped the dummy with his cane. "Keep that edge. You'll need it again someday." They headed inside, the sun dipping below the horizon. Ethan grabbed a glass of water, Carlos settled back in his armchair, and the house fell into its usual quiet. Ethan didn't ask how Carlos had heard, probably a neighbor's kid, or some gossip from town. It didn't matter. The old man knew, and that was enough. Over the next few days, Westwood High settled into a new normal. Liam's crew didn't vanish, they still sat at their table, still wore their jerseys, but the swagger was gone. Liam kept his head down, his voice low, avoiding Ethan's path. Connor and Mason followed his lead, their bruises fading but their confidence shaken. Olivia stuck closer to the cheer squad, her sharp edges dulled. Jake was the wild card, he started sitting with other sophomores, drifting from his brother's shadow, his eyes thoughtful when they crossed Ethan's in the hall. Ethan didn't seek attention, didn't bask in the whispers. He went back to his routine, bus, classes, lunch alone. The stares faded, the phones turned to other scandals, and the school moved on. But something lingered, a quiet respect, an unspoken shift. He wasn't a king or a hero, just the kid who'd stood his ground. That was fine by him. A week later, Ethan sat on the porch with Carlos, the night cool and clear. Stars pricked the sky, and a breeze rustled the trees. Carlos lit a cigarette, a rare habit now, saved for moments like this, and exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "You good?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. Ethan leaned back, hands behind his head. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." Carlos nodded, taking another drag. "Then that's all that matters." They sat there, the silence stretching out, the world turning slow around them. Ethan didn't need more than this, a house, a grandfather, a life he could call his own. Liam Carter was a memory now, a lesson learned. The edge was still there, sharp and ready, but for now, it could rest. And there you have it, the dust settles, the crowd fades, but the echoes of Ethan Rivera's stand linger long after the final bell. From the cafeteria's humiliation to that jaw-dropping showdown behind the gym, this is Heartfelt Tales at its rawest, a story of strength forged in silence, a bully brought low, and a school forever changed. Did Ethan's quiet power leave you stunned? Could you feel the tension crackling through every frame? I need to know. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. What hit you hardest? If this tale struck a chord, don't just walk away. Smash that like button to let us know, share it with anyone who needs a dose of real drama, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Heartfelt Tales. We've got more stories coming, gritty, emotional, unmissable, so hit that bell and stay with us. Until next time, keep feeling, keep fighting, and we'll see you in the next tale.